Lesson 12 in the story of Joseph, entitled The Sovereign Way of Grace. A tweet has a maximum of 140 characters. The story of Joseph, if captured in a tweet, might read something like this. The son the family rejected becomes the son the family depends on. At the end of the last lesson, we highlighted 3 marks of a community that's experiencing the kind of transformation, forgiveness, and reconciliation that Joseph's family experienced. First, there's hospitality, the kind Joseph extended to his family by taking care of them after he had rescued them. Second, reassurance, the kind Jacob received from his sons, but even more significantly from God, who appeared to him to tell him what we all long to hear God say, I will be with you. And then finally, in one of the most emotional scenes in all the Bible, a reunion. As Joseph throws his arms around his father and weeps his eyes out, it's a reversal of grace, so unexpected, shocking, and tender, that Jacob can only say, I can die in peace. But here's the thing, he doesn't die. Verse 28 of chapter 47 says that he kept on living in Egypt for 17 years. It's interesting, Joseph spent the first 17 years of his life under Jacob's care, and then Jacob spends the last 17 years of his life under Joseph's care. We're going to have to cover a rather long portion of Joseph's story today. We'll begin in verse 31 of chapter 46, and we'll go all the way through the end of chapter 48. After Joseph embraces his father, he does what he always does. He gets to work taking care of his family. He initiates a 2-part plan to make sure that Pharaoh makes good on his promise to welcome them and give them the best Egypt has to offer. First, beginning in verse 33 of chapter 46, he tells his brothers exactly what to say to Pharaoh when he summons them. And what a huge comfort this must have been. Can you imagine how intimidating it would be for a band of Hebrew shepherds to stand before an Egyptian Pharaoh? That's what Joseph tells them to tell him, that they're shepherds. First, it's true, they are bona fide shepherds. But second, verse 34 says, all shepherds were detestable to Egyptians. We've mentioned before how brilliant Joseph is. He's brilliant here again. Once Pharaoh hears what they do for a living, this will force him to keep his promise. They can't live in his house like Joseph does. They also have to own land, and preferably a large piece of it, so they can take care of all their animals. And finally, it will need to be remote, so that they're far away from the Egyptians. It's a strategy so clever, so compelling, that even Pharaoh winds up asking Joseph's brothers to take care of his livestock too. Second, beginning in verse 7 of chapter 47, Joseph brings Jacob in to bless him. Joseph knows his father's age far exceeds the normal Egyptian lifespan. He also knows that pharaohs are quite fond of thinking themselves eternal, always seeking as much as possible to be immortal. That's why Pharaoh asks Jacob in verse 8, how old are you? He can't help himself in the presence of such an aged patriarch. What he's really saying is, man, you are old. How in the world have you traveled this far? Jacob answers, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. And Pharaoh at this moment would have realized he was in the presence of greatness. Jacob's very humble about it all, saying, my years have been few and difficult, actually. They don't even equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. In other words, you should have seen my dad, Isaac, and my granddad, Abraham. Jacob then blesses Pharaoh. And what's so interesting about this is that Pharaoh doesn't object, even though it's a clear display of superiority. Pharaoh's probably never experienced something like this in his life before, let alone in his own house. He's not in charge. He's not calling the shots. He's not even the man in his own house. Jacob is, because God is with him. And this scene ends with another powerful picture of the son the family rejected becoming the son the family depends on. The text reads, Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt, gave them property in the best part of the land. He also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. He's doing everything to save them, just like our greater Joseph, Jesus, did absolutely everything to save us. And really, his story could end right here, but it doesn't. There's a radical shift in verse 13. There was no food, however, in the whole region because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph's family is getting settled, making a new life for themselves on the land Joseph gave them, and eating the food Joseph provided for them. But the famine gets worse everywhere else. And this is significant. Later in verse 27 we read, the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property, they were fruitful, they increased greatly in number. But the passage before that verse, which runs from verse 13 through 26, is entirely about Egypt's suffering during the very same famine. Do you see the point? Israel flourishes while Egypt suffers. We'll see why in a few minutes, but first, Jesus tells a story in Matthew 20 about the owner of a vineyard who goes out early one morning to hire some day laborers. They agree on an amount, and the workers leave to go work in his vineyard. 3 hours later, the owner returns and hires more workers. He does this again at noon, at 3, and at 5. Then at the end of the day, he lines them up to pay them, beginning with the ones he hired last. As those hired early begin to see that those hired later received the same amount that the owner agreed to pay them, they get very excited. They can only assume they're going to receive more, but they don't. And this makes them very angry. Then Jesus makes his point as the parable ends with the owner asking, don't I have the right to do what I want to do with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm so generous? Are you ever envious because God is so generous? I am. In fact, sometimes I don't really like the way Jesus has set up this kingdom of his, where the last get to be first and the first get to be last. Another way to think about this question is, do you have a love-hate relationship with grace? Think about it. Grace is never, ever fair. And grace is not only the point of Joseph's story, as we'll see in the remainder of this lesson. It's the point of all the stories in the Bible. Of the story the Bible keeps on telling. Grace is God telling Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. Grace is the psalmist writing, God is in heaven, he does whatever pleases him. Grace is Jesus praying, Father, forgive them. They don't even know what they're doing. Grace is Paul writing, it does not depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. You see, grace always has a sovereign way about it. It wouldn't be grace if it didn't. In the book of Genesis alone, God chooses Abram to be the father of his family for no apparent reason other than his grace. Then his son Isaac, the younger, gets chosen over Ishmael, the older, and it's Jacob, Isaac's deceitful son, who gets Isaac's blessing instead of Esau. And in the story of Joseph, you'll remember how Judah had such an awfully wicked past, and yet he becomes the leader of God's family in the end. Not to mention how many times we've pointed out how if you think your family is broken, be encouraged. The covenant family was much worse. My point is that God's grace always runs downhill, chasing after us like a reckless shepherd who pursues his one lost sheep even though it may cost him the other 99. I suppose we love this when we're the one lost sheep. But what if we're one of the 99? What we're going to do in the time we have left is go toe-to-toe for 2 rounds with grace. The first round will be with the grace Joseph gives Israel, but not Egypt. The second round will be with the grace Jacob gives Ephraim, not Manasseh. Each scene gives us a picture of God's grace, which, despite how much you love the hymn, is not always amazing. Sometimes grace is an enormous challenge. In the first round with grace, which takes place in verses 13 through 31 of chapter 47, Joseph does three things to Egypt, while his family, Israel, experiences the exact opposite. The result, Israel receives grace and Egypt does not. First, in verses 13 to 15, Joseph collects the Egyptians' money, all their money, as payment for food that he had saved to sell them. The people of Egypt become poor, and Pharaoh gets all their money. Then second, in verses 16 to 17, the famine continues. They return to Joseph with nothing but empty pockets. They're desperate for food. This time, Joseph commands them to give up all their livestock in exchange for food, which they willingly do. Now they have no money. They have no livestock. Pharaoh has both. Finally, on the brink of death, in verses 18 to 22, they come to Joseph one final time and offer themselves and their land in return for food in order to survive. And Joseph accepts the deal. All the land in Egypt, except what belonged to the priests, and of course Joseph's family, becomes Pharaoh's. And all the Egyptian people, every man, woman, child, become his slaves. You can't get any worse than this. No money, no animals, no land, and they're slaves. And yet they're still grateful to be alive. They're so indebted to Joseph, they say to him, "You've saved our lives. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh." But their gratitude, despite such loss, is not nearly as shocking as what happens to the covenant family in the meantime. While Joseph is taking everything from Egypt, he takes nothing from Israel. They keep their money, their animals, their land. They don't become slaves. Verse 27 reveals they even gain possessions and multiply their numbers during the famine. You may have heard grace defined as unmerited favor, but grace is actually even more than that. To say that grace is unmerited favor is to say we do nothing to deserve it, which is true, but reflect for a moment on what plays out in Genesis 47. Joseph sells food at an incredibly high price. Cost of money, animals, land, even lives, to those who serve him, who were grateful to him. But at the same time, he protects and provides for those who sold him out. Joseph takes from those who serve him and gives back to those who wanted to kill him. Grace is not just amazing, it's an enormous challenge. It gets pretty uncomfortable to see Jesus in this part of the story, if you take time to reflect on it. In order to give us grace, God had to take everything from Jesus, even though Jesus served him, in order to give everything to us who crucified him. God took his life to give us life. Grace is more scandalous than unmerited favor. Grace is demerited favor. We don't just do nothing to deserve it. We repeatedly do all kinds of things to deserve the opposite. That's round one. Round two takes place in Genesis 48. Joseph hears that Jacob is ill and near death, so he brings his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to see him. In verse 5, Jacob adopts Joseph's sons, makes them his own. Bruce Waltke writes, Joseph's sons now enjoy equal status with Reuben and Simeon. Oh, Joseph would have loved this side of grace. But then Jacob does something that creates a lot of tension, or the other side of the love-hate relationship we often have with grace. You see, even though Joseph is quite acquainted with grace, he's about to be thrown for a grace loop. In verse 8, a ceremony begins. Jacob asks Joseph, "Who are these?" Speaking of Joseph's sons. He doesn't ask Joseph this because he doesn't know who they are. He's already adopted them. He asks for the same reason that a minister asks the father of the bride, "Who gives this woman to this man?" In a ceremony, you ask questions you already know the answer to. Now picture Joseph as he brings his sons to Jacob. He would have intentionally had Ephraim on his right and Manasseh on his left, because this would put Manasseh on Jacob's right and Ephraim on Jacob's left. Manasseh is the oldest and therefore deserves a bigger blessing. So Joseph would have placed him on Jacob's right. But as Jacob blesses the boys, he portrays the sovereign way of grace. He crosses his hands, placing his right hand on Ephraim's head and his left hand on Manasseh's. Joseph sees what's happening and says in verse 18, No, my father, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." And Jacob refuses and says, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than him." Verse 20 then concludes, "He put Ephraim before Manasseh." The scene then ends with Jacob telling Joseph three things. One, that he's about to die. Two, but that God will be with him. And three, that he's given him a piece of land. It seems kind of random. It's translated slope or ridge. In Hebrew, the word is Shechem. And this would have made the original audience sit up and listen, because Shechem is the name of the land Jacob purchased back in Genesis 33. It's also the name of the man whose father, Hamor, owned that land. This Shechem was the man who raped Dinah, Jacob's daughter, in Genesis 34. And if you remember, it was Simeon and Levi who sought revenge against this city in defense of their sister's honor. They killed everyone and took everything. And because of their cruelty, combined with Reuben's later sexual sin against Bilhah, this is why the leadership of the family falls all the way to Judah. So when Jacob adopts Ephraim and Manasseh, what he's doing is he's replacing Reuben and Simeon with Joseph's sons. This is huge grace. Jacob is giving Joseph a double portion. However, then comes the grace loop. When Jacob favors Ephraim over Manasseh, also an act of sheer grace, this puts Joseph in a position where he experiences the opposite side. You see, in the first half of this scene, when Jacob adopts Manasseh and Ephraim, Joseph gets more than he could have ever imagined. But in the second half of this scene, when Jacob puts Ephraim ahead of Manasseh, he gets so much less than he hoped for. Joseph experiences what we experience, kind of a love-hate relationship with grace. Amazing, but also enormous challenge. Why? Because God's grace, by definition, is the opposite of what's conventional. It's the opposite of what's expected, the opposite of what anyone else, including each of us, would do in the exact same situation. God's ways are never our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. His kingdom is entirely upside down, and all we can really do as characters in the drama of redemption is roll with the punches as we engage in rounds with grace. To whatever extent you have a controlling personality, and we all have one to some extent, grace will mess with you, but it'll mess with you to rescue you. I've had you do a lot of imagining in this lesson series. To close, I want you to imagine another scene with me. I want you to imagine that you're approaching God the Father with your older brother Jesus walking beside you, much the same way that Ephraim and Manasseh approached Jacob. Jesus, the righteous, holy, faithful, firstborn Son, is on God the Father's right. And you, the unrighteous, sinful, doubtful, younger son or daughter, are on the Father's left. You kneel before the Father and you are comforted that Jesus is with you, but you're still quite fearful, anxious of what's going to happen. Your head is bowed, your eyes are closed, and a feeling of peace floods your soul as you feel God the Father's soft hand of blessing resting upon your head. But the moment you take a deep breath of relief, you also hear and feel a tremor. The crashing down of his other hand, balled up in a fist as it comes pounding down with the full force of his anger onto Jesus' head, knocking him flat, dead to the floor. You look up with tears in your eyes, and you see why. God has crossed his hands. And you, the illegitimate but now adopted son or daughter, are blessed by grace, but only because Jesus, the true and righteous Son, has been cursed, crushed in your place, also by grace. Grace is free, but it's never cheap. It cost Jesus everything to give you everything, and when you see that, you'll gladly give him everything. Amen.